You're listening to the Dead Padawans Society, a science fiction and fantasy podcast celebrating the ideas, mythologies, and truths in iconic works of sci-fi. I'm your host, Brett Inman, joined by my friend,
Nic Dennis. How are you, Brett?
Nick. I'm having a good year so far. How about you?
Happy New Year.
Yeah.
So
it's crazy that it's 2019 too. Like that to me.
Yeah, it 18 went by pretty quick,
Yeah.
I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how about New Year, new obsession? Anything interesting you right now?
Well, right before the end of last year, and I'm actually hoping that they do a 3D release of this to home video because I definitely want to see it again. But I was able to catch They Shall Not Grow Old, which they did as a Fathom event. It actually was
The World War I movie.
Yeah, the World War I film. It was produced by and constructed by Peter Jackson, and it was phenomenal.
It was the archive footage from the British Museum?
Yes, so the British Museum had a lot of material. They had archival footage. They had also, the BBC had done an extensive series of interviews with World War I vets in the 60s and 70s, so survivors of the war.
Mm-hmm.
And so the film is constructed entirely out of material from the period. So it's all period footage that has been restored, and the work that Jackson and his team did to restore that is super, super interesting. And then it
looks incredible.
Yeah.
The trailers for it look fantastic.
In addition to restoring it, they also colorized a significant portion of the film. So whenever they actually go to war, you feel like you're looking at closer to modern day footage than stuff that was shot in the 19 teens. And so Jackson lets these vets tell their story. So there are no historians that pop in. It's all very personal perspective.
Oh, that's interesting. So nobody setting the scenes, it's only their perspective.
Yeah, it's all them talking about, this was what was going on. This, I enlisted because that was what everybody was doing. I was 14 at the time, and
Wow.
all these, that was actually having a 1-year-old, 1.5-year-old, and expecting our second in May, and both of them boys. I realized, oh my goodness, that there were children going to this war, and it gave me. I've never watched a war movie as a dad before, so that kind of gave me a new, fresh perspective on it. But
yeah, 14 is insane.
Yeah, 14, 15, 16. There were a lot of those kids that would get their age changed on their official documentation.
Right.
But
so
as you watch the footage, you see faces, and you're like, that is a kid. Oh my goodness. And
wow.
The war was horrific, and this film really does a good job of showing that. For me, World War I has always been a footnote at best. It's
for most people.
It's not, especially in the United States. It's not World War II, which is the war we won and we're all proud of, and it's not the Civil War, which is this defining moment in our country. It's kind of this bump. America didn't get involved until later, and as it turns out, the war didn't end with a winner or a loser.
Yeah, it's like our glorious wars are the Revolution and World War II, and the dour ones are the Civil War and Vietnam.
Yeah.
And those are the four that get the most focus in history classes.
Yeah, because of world events, Korea occasionally gets a little bit, and there are still some Korean vets that are alive. And then, we've had some military conflicts even in our lifetimes, but they definitely weren't on the scale that some of those older wars have been. But it was a phenomenal film. For me, it gave perspective to that. I actually left the theater wondering if people at that time had been able to see this footage that I've just seen. I wonder how that would have reshaped the 20th century.
Yeah.
Because at the period, and Jackson actually goes into this, the cameras that were used were all hand crank cameras. And so this footage did get shot, but it was largely put in archives. And a lot of the stuff that people actually saw would either be printed. So there were publications in Jackson. It turns out is actually a huge World War I nerd. And so he had this nearly complete set of these pamphlets that came out during the wartime, and something illustrated, but it basically told the story of the war. And they would get illustrators to do these largely propaganda like
like
illustrations,
sugarcoating it.
Yeah, and showing the glories of the war, or playing up that kind of thing, and really hiding a lot of the horrors of it. And that also continues to be true if you look at World War II. There were lots of films and lots of people were involved, but it largely was glorified. We're fighting evil, and let's support our boys, and so that kind of thing happened. And really in the United States, it's not until you get to Vietnam that people actually start seeing what war is really like. And you have riots and people fighting the draft and those types of things. And seeing this footage, I wondered if the people who were alive at this time had been able to see the horrors of it, would that have stopped or averted or changed the way other wars happened? Would people have realized the cost in human life and in dignity and subjecting humans to the kinds of horrors that happen?
It's interesting how technology and its progression affects the cultural, the culture, the mood, and people's perspectives on what's happening. Like a big example of that is the Nixon and JFK debate. Like when they met, people who heard them on the radio thought Nixon clearly won that debate, but those who were watching TV,
sweaty, stubbly Richard Nixon and
whereas
picture perfect JFK,
exactly, seeming calm and collected, that people tended to side with him in that argument. Well, that sounds incredible. I can't wait to see it because I missed the Fathom event for it. Yeah, but I mean, it'll be coming out soon on DVD and Blu-ray.
Yeah, there even is the possibility it did have a lot of success as a Fathom event. Actually, I was reading an article that said
it might get extended?
Possibly, or I forget who the distributor is, but they may actually realize, we have something on our hands here there may be mass appeal, so it may end up getting a smaller theatrical release.
Oh, that would be cool.
Instead of just special events. So.
Well, over the holiday, I watched a lot of holiday theater movies like Aquaman.
What'd you think of it?
Mary Poppins and those. Well, my favorite. Yeah, they were good. My favorite though, for the holiday season, is got to be Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I went and saw that, and oh my goodness, that movie has to be one of the best Spider-Man movies, if not the best. I don't know where I would put it in the ranking of all the films, but it is just a fun ride and a fun time at the theater. And so I got to see that. It's the story of Miles Morales and the different universes that the different spider people from across the comics come from. It has a lot of references to past films, past comics, other pop culture places Spider-Man has popped up.
So one of the things I've wondered, does it feel like the Lego Batman movie at all? Because I mean, it's a Lord and Miller project.
It has, yes, it has that riffing quality to it, that it's self-referential, and it has a little bit of fourth wall breaking, and it's self-aware of what it's doing and the jokes that it's making that are appealing to the audience. And so there is some of that there, but it works. It works not as a parody, which is really cool. Because there's all of these universes, you can play off of that that exists in that universe, or this has happened to this character there, and you can reference it, and it works. Like, you can reference, there's some really fun gags about past Spider-Man movies, and they can get away with it because you're in this weird mishmash universe that all of these different realities are colliding at one point. And so they can throw in different funny story beats of the past, and you recognize it because you've seen, the Sam Raimi Spider-Mans and the Andrew Garfield ones, and they take good things from those, and they take some bad things from those and riff on them. And it's just a really fun movie.
I'm a little amazed that they were able to sell a multiverse pitch. Like, to me, that seems like that would be a tall order for a studio. Now, we're going to do a Spider-Man movie, and they're like, oh, great, we need to do something with this franchise so Marvel doesn't get it back. And then they're like, we want to do a multiverse. And they're like, wait, what? What?
I feel like it being, because when this was first announced, and we were already getting the Marvel and Sony new Spider-Man, like Homecoming with what's his name? I forget the new Spider-Man guy, but the new live action movies, and then they announced that they were going to do an animated project. It made a lot of people scratch their heads, like, why? You have a successful live action Spider-Man right now. Oh, Tom Holland, that's who it is. You have a successful franchise going with him and these characters, and it's in the Marvel MCU. So why would you put this out at the same time? And it's animated? That's a little weird.
Yeah.
But honestly, I feel like there's a possibility it could have worked in live action, but it definitely worked because it was in animated form. Because one thing that's really cool is all the separate characters from their universes retain their animation style when they come over. So the anime Penny Parker, it still looks anime, and when she's in action, there's a lot of anime elements that happen. Same thing with Spider-Man Noir. Like, he's completely black and white the whole time, even though he's in a color universe. And they do some gags with that as well. And what's another? Oh, Spider-Ham has his very Looney Tunes looking, very flat almost, 2D. Yeah. And he retains a lot of his, and they do visual gags that are very like old style pulp, cartoony version. So when he's in action, and I don't understand how they did it, but it melds well, even though they are very contrasting characters, but they're all in the same scene, and you just roll with it. And I don't know how they did it, but it's all visually appealing, and there's nothing like that. Just at no time you're thinking that just sticks out and it doesn't work. Yeah. It was done very well. They did a really good job of meshing it all together. And the story is good. Yeah. Like, it's a solid story. You could say that maybe it's a little, like, you could guess where it's going, that it may be a little formulaic and basic, but because it's playing with so much fun elements, you don't even care. Like, you could probably guess the path of this movie is going to take, but because you're having so much fun watching it, and these characters playing off of each other, they have such great chemistry, it doesn't matter. You're enjoying yourself anyway. Yeah.
Okay, Spider-Man's great, but what'd you think of Aquaman, for real?
I enjoyed it. It is a light superhero film. It's pretty good for the DC universe. I think I had fun with it. I'll say that. Now,
going in, do you think you would have been able to guess what the plot was, having like seen it now? Like,
parts of it, because I've watched a lot of trailers, and they even did an extended trailer beforehand, so I had a pretty good idea, but there was still plenty of things that I couldn't have known.
Do you think you would have done better than you did with Alien?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So today we're going to be talking about Alien. It was made in 1979, directed by Ridley Scott, and it features, just for those of you listening, spoilers aplenty from here on in. First off, I want to talk with Nick a little bit just about so in the last episode, we had him watch 13 minutes of the film and give his synopsis of it.
Of the entire
plot. He then had to fill in the rest of the plot. And there were a couple things you were right on. What would you say you were actually like, hey, I got that. I deserve some credit for that.
I think I said that the alien itself wasn't like super intelligent, but it was just more of like an apex predator type. And so the fact that it doesn't like have its own ships and its own technology, that it's just kind of eating off of using other organisms to get around the galaxy. I think I said that, and so I was correct on that. Although I did say that it was hive-minded.
There's no evidence of that in this film.
Yeah, so that wasn't there. I said it needed incubators for its young to grow, but I'm pretty sure I just knew that from pop culture. Because that clearly happens to one character in here.
I'll be honest, as you were going through your synopsis last time, I I had to fight back laughter almost the entire time, because it was so, like, you were so close, and then you just make this hard left, and I'm like, where'd that come from? So you have them docking with a ship that's in orbit around some planet, and of course they land on the planet. It
was still a ghost ship.
Yeah,
where crew is dead.
So one of my favorite things, though, whenever I ask you the order of deaths, okay, because I knew, like, that was something you couldn't necessarily just have sussed out, and I love that it was almost completely backwards.
Yeah, I had a couple. Right, like I had Harry Dean Stanton dying early. Mm-hmm. I thought the other crew member, woman Lambert, was going to, because she didn't have much at the beginning.
And she is one of the survivors.
She's one of the survivors. I thought that because this movie was in the 70s and it was a 70s horror, that the black guy was going to get killed off immediately. But he lasted. He was the last one to survive, apart from Ripley. And so that was a nice surprise. What else did I get right?
Well, and the other big thing that you got wrong that, again, I had to fight back laughter on. So this movie's title is
Alien.
And it features
an alien.
One alien. And the sequel is called
Aliens.
And it features
aliens.
Yeah, so
which I did know, I did know that about Aliens, that there were a lot more, and I also knew that there was one big alien in this movie, but for some reason or another, I just thought
you had 3 on the ship, and you had Ash facing off against other, which that was another one. Whenever you started talking about Ash, and I even teased at a betrayal, and I just wanted to see what you would do with that. But you gave Ash like a heroic ending in your synopsis.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. Because you said maybe there's somebody nefarious on there, and I went with my idea that there was a alien stowaway, and so I was like, oh yeah, like
Brett or Parker.
Brett or Parker brought one on board because they love money, and they're gonna try to sell it when they get home. So they're the cause of this whole thing, and they're trying to keep it alive. But and then I made Ash the hero.
Yeah. Well, now that you've actually seen it, like, what did you think? Just base level, like, what did you?
I enjoyed where I was wrong, because then I had surprises and nice things, like that Ash was an android. That twist, that was probably the best part about it. That clearly, it was funny when I was watching it, because I remembered you asking, maybe there's a shady character, and then as the movie is building up, I'm like, oh, it's him, because you could see his face and how he was reacting to the chest burster and what was people disappearing, and you can start telling that there's something going on with this guy. But then the reveal that he's actually an android was just a out of left field nice surprise. Mm-hmm. So I really enjoyed that part. I'm glad I didn't get that right or was anywhere close, because that surprised me, and I was happy for that to be a revelation.
Yeah, and it actually revealed to me, because I was kind of expecting you to have picked up a lot of things about the movie from cultural osmosis. Yeah. And to me, what you demonstrated is that this film does do a lot of interesting and unique things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, even though, I mean, it came out around the time that a lot of these tropes were even being created, and so it would have been very easy for it to have done those same kinds of things and even not felt cliche about doing them.
If I was just completely not knowing anything about this series of films, and not knowing that Ripley is the action hero protagonist of these films, I don't know if I would have had her in the end. I don't know, because again, from that initial setup of the film, she doesn't get a ton of play in those first minutes. Like, her character gets more and more screen time as the bad things start happening, because you see that she's the character that's keeping her head and still trying to go by the book and to make the smart decisions. But everything I saw before that was pre-decision making Ripley. And so if I wouldn't have known that she is the iconic character that she is, maybe I wouldn't have known that in the end she'd be the sole survivor getting away. But I did get that right.
You did get that right. You did get that right. So, like I said, spoilers throughout this episode. I also want to give a special caution as we get started here. This episode is going to have some mature content. So if one of our 4 listeners is, a parent of a child and you're listening to this on a car ride, or if you're listening to at work, you may want to turn this off or skip it and kind of come back to it some other time.
Put some headphones in.
Yeah.
Because this is an R-rated movie, and it's a particularly dark in its themes and what it's using. And so, definitely mature content warning. What's something, before we dive into what the discussion I want to talk about with this film, tell me something that you just really enjoy about Alien.
The design work, and I oftentimes talk about visuals, but for me, the look of this film is wholly unique, and the way it has since influenced everything. And I'm not just talking about Geiger's design either. The design of the Nostromo to me is really, really interesting in the way that it's a little more industrial. And then in watching some of the supplementals, to talk about the work, that they built sets that basically were the Nostromo. So it reminded me even a little bit of ship. Like Firefly, where they basically built the ship, and so those actors were able to go from corridor to corridor and actually
still
kind of explore
all
the
be
space.
inside. Yeah, there weren't any cutout sections. It was really cool when they were talking about what they wanted the ship to look like. At first, their original build of it, it was really tall, and they started talking about how you're not going to see the roof of it because of us shooting in widescreen, and so they decided to cut out a huge section of the wall and then drop the ceiling down of the entire. They had the thing built, and then they cut out several, a couple feet out of the wall, dropped it down. But then they found out that they really liked that because it gave you the feel of it was more tight, more like a submarine, that the monitors and everything were right in your face, and it made it a lot more claustrophobic, which played into the
absolutely the survival horror elements of it.
Exactly, trapped in the haunted house and nowhere to go kind of feel to it. And I love when accidents like that on not exactly accidents, but the need for something actually enhances something else. And so that Giger's designs across he was a part of so many aspects of it that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But to this day, they're iconic. The alien is iconic. It's still being used in films today. And as far as an alien design, I can't think of one that is more terrifying, or the elements of it, like the chest burster, the face hugger, those suckers. I've seen a plush. Have you seen the plush face hugger? Yeah. I still don't want to touch that thing.
I agree. Yeah.
It's still way too creepy, even though it's felt and puffy, and there's cotton inside of it. I don't want to touch that thing because it still looks creepy and like a creepy crawly.
Yeah. So the design is great. I also really love. So this is another one of those films like Moon, where you have normal people in space.
Right.
And so for me, that
kind of the original.
Yeah. And as is pretty obvious, this film influenced Moon. But
right, you've got the nefarious corporation, you've got the people just trying to do a job and get to the end of it.
But the way that the film was shot, and this film is often cited for having overlapping dialogue and stuff. You get a sense that these are just very average people, truckers in space. And so for me, that I like seeing, because a lot of science fiction, you look at the best and brightest, and it's very detached from who we are. And so to see what do average people do whenever, space has gotten to the point where us normies are going.
Right. There's nobody getting philosophic about the universe or their place in it.
Yeah.
It's people in corridors arguing about what they should be doing in this
share of
situation.
pay.
Right, their share of pay, or why are you allowing the science officer? He's like, because that's what the company wants.
Yeah.
Like, I'm here, I run the ship. Like, stop crawling up my butt about it. Like,
So that, and I love that, because
like
again,
work,
that's,
just like workplace grinding.
Yeah, because it makes the work relatable in a way that sometimes science fiction can be a little detached, and so this feels very very grounded in that way. So and then it immediately causes you to put yourself in that situation. One thing I would actually say about this franchise is that I'm sad. In my opinion, it kind of drifts away from that over time. So this film, it was definitely truckers in space. And even by the second film, Ripley, and I'll be interested whenever you see that film.
Well, I know enough about it to know Aliens is more of an action a movie than a horror, and it's like military. It's a military operation that's more pro, like, because they know the alien is there, and so it's an active mission that from the get. I would assume, is that correct? And so even in that way, it's like you're sending highly skilled people for a mission that they're going after. And so in that way, it's not unassuming people, normal people who going about their day.
Well, and
this happens.
These ordinary people, I mean, they largely bumble into the situation in Alien. Like, they're not, they're not researchers. It's not Star Trek where they're out trying to explore strange new worlds.
Yeah, true. They get rerouted, and it's like we have to go by what the book says. We have to go see what it is, and if there's something, we do, bring it back or check it out and report back to the corporation. And so, they're not even. And then there's a couple characters that aren't interested at all. They just want to get home and get paid. They're like, forget this. And so, probably should have listened to them. There's several points where you should have listened to different characters on what to do in this. But that's a horror movie. A lot of times is wisdom or the right thing that should have been done is given, but the characters take a different road for. Yeah.
Well, and this film is a very clear melding of those two genres of sci-fi and horror. It is basically one part sci-fi, one part horror, and let's put those two pieces together. And this is the result that you get. Even in listening to some stuff from the writer O'Bannon, he talks about how he wanted to make a horror film and how he was really into sci-fi. So you can tell those are his influences.
So before we go any further, maybe this isn't an episode for kids or for listening out loud at work. So just know that going forward, we're going to be getting into a bit of grim, a bit dark material. So in Alien, there are a lot of allusions to sexual activities, and I feel, and it's well known that it's using different imagery to evoke a certain type of horror, a psychosexual horror in this movie. They brought in the designer, H.R. Giger, specifically the Dan O'Bannon, the screenwriter, and Ridley Scott read one of his compilation books of his artwork. Anyway, the screenwriter and Ridley Scott got a hold of this book and fell in love with the art style of it. But if you go and look at the imagery that Giger put in his paintings and his illustrations, it's very sexual. It's a particular style that I find interesting because he himself was fluent in German expressionist horror, which is very kind of linked to humans and machines and sexual biochemical relationships, and is kind of obsessed with that idea, which I find really interesting because we've talked about Metropolis before, which was also in like a German expressionism field, and then my mind immediately went to the android in that, which is like a very sexualized version of a machine that then turns into this evil sexual being that entices men to follow her and dooms the city. And so I thought that was very interesting since he was drawing on that same tradition, and we've already talked about that. But this idea of like twisting the beauty that is in sex, but twisting it into a nightmarish hellscape in order to take something desirable and make it unnerving and unnatural and make people uneasy with it and drawing on that horror aspect of it. And then getting into, we talked about a little bit before, the 80s slasher movie, where a lot of those are very sexual focused, where you've got teens who, I mean, we've talked about this before, like those old horror movies are almost like moral lessons, where the kids who are drinking and partying and having sex are usually the ones who are picked off first, to where the more virtuous person is the one who gets away at the end. It's usually that person who is the one that escapes the killer, and thus kind of enforcing that message that's a little bit under the surface. Yeah, and as we were taught, because we usually discuss these a little bit beforehand, but the moral lessons that are in some of those, you almost wonder if that's a reaction against some, like in the case of the late 70s, early 80s slasher movies, if that's a reaction against the sexual revolution that happened in the late 60s. Right. That, because I mean, sometimes like this free expression and these people going outside of the norm culture of what we've all been used to, kind of seen, and then a pendulum swinging back. Yeah, and it becomes a metaphor for the danger of sexually transmitted diseases. There have been a lot of, in fact, even one of the later Alien films ends up using somewhat of a metaphor about the AIDS crisis, and so you get some of those types of things, and the dangers that come in from taking certain actions. But yeah, they're definitely, and I've read some interesting articles before about how horror movies actually oftentimes tend to be some of the Moralistic stories that we have, which is you almost wouldn't think that, but they do. They exist in a world where if you do something transgressive, so and you're going to be killed violently. Even in that. And so the designer of this movie, which is where it started with Dan O'Bannon's story, and then some other writers came in order to flesh out the story, but from the get they were focusing on his iconography and imagery for this. And Giger himself designed the alien, the ship, the eggs, the face hugger. I mean, like everything to do with this alien, he was over the design for it. And since a lot of his stuff within his work beforehand had a very sexual, dark nature to it, a lot of that found its way into this film. I would actually say, though, some of that came into the work even beforehand. So you mentioned that Dan O'Bannon, the writer, consulted with some other people. One of the early story producers actually introduced the idea of, basically, O'Bannon was trying to find a way to get the alien on the ship. Because he wanted to tell this story, horror story, this alien, claustrophobic, on this ship with these people, and he needed to find a way to get it on there. And one of his story members says, well what if the alien has sex with him, but like with his face, and sends this tube down him and implants like its seed inside of one of the crew members. And so that was before Giger was involved in the design of the film. This was during the story phase. So those types of sexual ideas were already being introduced, at the very kind of almost inception of this story. Yeah. Well, then naturally, since the film has come out, the culture has gotten their hands on it and have been analyzing what's in there and what the movie is trying to get across. People have naturally picked up on these aspects of it within the design and within the story of what's happening, and drawing on that and saying this is a very like sexualized horror, and what they're showing is traumatic and very risque stuff for the time. I would say one of the it draws on a lot of even rape imagery. Yeah. And so that definitely it's hard to even say that that's subtextual. Like it's so right. There's people who believe that it is a straight allegory for for that experience. I found a quote from David McKenty, who's a film critic, and he actually wrote the book Beautiful Monsters, which is focusing on the both Alien and Predator franchises, and specifically on the monsters within them. And so he says, I found this quote. He says, "Alien is a rape movie with male victims. It's not just about people trying not to get eaten by a drooling monstrous animal. It's worse. It's about them trying not to get raped by a drooling monstrous animal." It draws upon that fear in that imagery in a very specific way that people I don't believe are reading too far into it.
Oh no, I mean, well, and the thing is, you don't even have to try to read into it, because the creators have mentioned that there are intentional connections to rape and to that sexual, like it was part of the design.
Yeah. Now, there was a supplement. I think you had watched a bit of different material than I did, because I watched this documentary that was about an hour and a half long with the creators, and them talking about the designs and talking about from start to finish different aspects of it in the production and the story and all this, and it was very much in detail, and not once in this documentary. And it made me wonder, I was like, maybe this was the documentarian or what this one was used for, but they didn't talk about sex at all in that. And I started getting frustrated in watching it, and I'm like, when are they going to address this? Like, when are they going to talk about this? Because it seems a bit like wrong that they're not talking about it, because it's clearly there. And so maybe that was the case. Maybe the intention of that was not to get into these deeper, darker aspects of the film.
I'm sure some Fox suit is like, can we not talk about that?
Can we cut all of those things out of there? Maybe I got the PG documentary when I was looking at it. But yeah, I was getting frustrated because I was just like, this was clearly what y'all are doing here, and no one's mentioning it. But okay, so I'm glad to know that they are at least that they've at least acknowledged that yes, this was the intention.
It was those things were by design.
They weren't just putting it in there and trying to get around talking about it or saying.
Yeah, it wasn't,
because some filmmakers will be that way, where people are like, "Are you saying, like, is this what you're saying here?" And then they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
But
now I would say, having also looked a little bit at the sequel, Aliens, James Cameron, and I mean that film doesn't have as many of those tones to it, but James Cameron, I do think was taking a very different approach to it than, but yeah, Ridley Scott and then the writers, it's more than subtext.
Yeah,
and it's definitely something that they were together, in discussing and putting in this film.
So, okay, getting into that then. So all of these elements are in the film, but I want to ask you, because at the end of watching it for the first time, this was my very first question I had in my mind. So is the message or the purpose of this movie, and particularly the message, what is the message of this film, and is it clear to the viewer?
Yeah, I after, because you asked that question the other day to give me a little bit of time to think about it, and I've even talked with a few other people, and to me, whenever you ask that question, I paused for a moment because it didn't readily come to mind, and I've seen this film a few times.
And the same thing happened to me when I was sitting there watching it, and so at the end, a lot of times when I first watch a movie, I'm not in analysis mode of it. I just want to feel the story out and try to, I mean, if it's an enjoyable one, to enjoy what's on there, and then to see if I have any type of like emotional connection or reaction to it. And then on rewatches, diving into, well, what is the like core message here? And so I wasn't actively thinking about it during the film, but afterward I sat there and I was like, well, what was this saying? Because in a slasher movie or something like that, I'm not thinking trying to deeply think about what is the core message of this slasher film, but I knew this was Alien, right? And this was Ridley Scott. And so I thought, there's got to be something.
Even works of sci-fi tend to have.
Right, and it's sci-fi. Yeah. And so my immediate thought is, what is this film trying to convey? What is its message? And I sat there for a while, and I'm like, I'm a little stumped. I don't know exactly what it is. There has been an idea put forward that I've found in different perspectives on this work of that the purpose of Alien and that its intent and its message it's trying to convey is to instill the horrors of rape and of assault in men in order to produce empathy for women who have gone through assault, impregnation, and violent childbirth.
Okay, that's interesting. So because the alien is coming after these men on the ship.
Yeah, that they're the primary ones experiencing this, and
that Ripley survives.
Right. And thus men in the theaters and at home watching this unfold on these men are receiving by way of putting themselves in their shoes, receiving this horror on themselves that women in reality, have gone through. So the idea of, and going back to that quote from before, this is a movie about men being, raped by an alien. And so anyway, but the idea being put forward that the purpose of this movie is to instill that fear in men so that they can then grow in empathy for women who have experienced this trauma that they haven't.
That's actually really interesting. So after you asked the question, what is the theme of Alien, and I was really struggling with it. One thing that did come to mind, I started thinking about this purely as a horror film. So set aside that it, in the way sci-fi a lot of times has a stated message or conceit that it's trying to present. And that usually becomes pretty clear. Horror actually tends to be more about catharsis. So the idea of catharsis, it's introduced by Aristotle, basically that through, and he was talking largely about tragedy, but by, why would somebody want to watch a tragedy? Well, in watching a tragedy, you get to experience this tragic event, but you also get resolution through it. And so it actually kind of helps you to both deal with the situations that you've had in your life, while also giving you sort of a vicarious experience of overcoming it. Right. And so a lot of horror movies are built around that idea. You get to experience fear, but in a safe environment.
Because their demons are played out on screen to where you can start exercising your own personal demons through connecting to that experience.
Yeah, and so that to me is, again, a lot of horror works do that. And so I can definitely see how a person could come at this and come up with that. I don't know that I agree with that, though.
Yeah.
Like that, for me, I feel like Alien actually is maybe being a little bit exploitative of the idea of rape. It's using it to evoke a reaction from the audience, but not necessarily to build any kind of empathy. Like I think that's wishful thinking, if it is anything.
Well, yeah, I mean, just going off of my personal experience in the watch, I was obviously had, moments of terror and horror in this movie where I was very unsettled, and the events that were happening, were putting me on edge, and you get that feeling of, you can do it, get there, and you're with Ripley. But yeah, at no time did I feel like I didn't feel that message being conveyed to where if it's subtext, it, in thinking about it afterward, that didn't immediately come to, oh, I see. This is, I'm supposed to experience this, and then I can understand why people who've been through this, how traumatic it's been. Like, I didn't initially make that connection, and so it makes me wonder how many people is that lost on, if it is there.
I would even say that sometimes you are as much rooting for the alien as you are for the people on the ship. I mean, there's a certain amount of joy that you're taking as an observer of, you know, the cat and mouse game that's sort of going on the ship.
Right, because you know you're in a horror. And you know there's going to be expendable characters, and you want to see the monster. Like, you want to see the monster, you want to see it in action. People are coming for that. And so, again, like, not exactly catharsis, but like when it happens, there's some satisfaction there of, oh, it got him. Like, that's so gross, that's so terrible, but that's what you paid to come see. And so, yeah, I can see where that, that's a bit problematic there.
Yeah. And so for me, I mean, that's really, I think, where I land on this film's use of rape imagery and of, you know, sexual assault imagery, is that I'm actually a little uncomfortable, and I kind of question the ethics of using it the way it did. So I mentioned at the top of the show that one of the things I recently saw was They Shall Not Grow Old, which is a World War I documentary, and it shows the horrors of war. Well, I'm also a fan of universal horror. So those early, not the recent MonsterVerse that they tried to launch, but the
not the Mummy.
Yeah. But the original films. And so in watching some of the documentaries and things on those older films, I was already aware that the artists who were creating those, and so the directors, the makeup artists, those people had, several of them, been involved in World War I. Like, they were, field soldiers. They also were living in a post-World War I world. And what that meant, I actually learned something interesting in researching this. World War I, in addition to being incredibly brutal and gruesome, I mean, basically people were not prepared. There was still kind of a last century mindset, even though we were fighting a 20th century war. And medical advances had gotten to a point where people who previously would have died of their wounds on the battlefield are now being rescued. But that still left a lot of them incredibly disfigured. And so after the war was over, there were a large number of men who came back from the field, the walking wounded, people who had, serious disfigurement. And even, surgery had improved. So you were able, if somebody... flamethrowers were used in the war, but you were able to do some reconstructive surgery, and or if somebody got hit by a shell or
mustard gas or something like that.
Yeah, there were a lot of really horrific disfigurements that these soldiers had coming back from that. And what you see the Universal monster movies doing is actually taking some elements of that and incorporating it into their designs for these monsters. And I always was just like, okay, that's interesting, and I get how that's kind of creepy and stuff, but those were human beings. Like, these are real people, and there are certain,
to base it off a human being and then call it a monster.
Exactly.
Like the same, aspects of their likeness.
Yeah, it really is inhumane. Now, one film that I feel like, and of the Universal horror films, the one that probably most people are connected to, maybe besides Dracula, Frankenstein, James Whale. So you have a monster that is largely designed in that sense. In fact, there are people who make connections even between some of the other imagery, of like the graveyard and trench warfare. Like, if you look at an image from World War I, and you look at the set design and the way you've got these kind of graves strewn about, there definitely is some influence being drawn. And so, but the thing that stands out to me, so you have this character then, Frankenstein's monster, which is more monstrous than Shelley's. So if you read the original Shelley novel,
it's not.
The doctor actually is trying to use the best parts of corpses to make this beautiful being. And so while beautiful, it's still a little unnerving, but it's not
as grotesque as well in
whereas the Universal one is grotesque and drawing on, again, that look that you would have seen in somebody returning from war with a serious disfigurement. And so for me, that film then presents this character as sympathetic, this monster. And so for me, that gives some of the humanity back to those people. Like, you look at somebody and you judge them based on what they look like. But whenever he interacts with the blind man, and is treated like any other human. You see that there is value on the inside, and so I think that is making a good statement. It's using that horrific thing, because the thing is, war is horrific, and I think that's really whenever we see somebody who has an injury from war, or has some kind of disfigurement from that, I think the right feeling we're supposed to have is fear and concern, and we shouldn't be flippant about war. Like, it is a serious thing. Right. And so properly placed, that can be a good feeling. But whenever you just use it because you want to make your monster scarier, whenever you take the nose off of Lon Chaney in The Phantom of the Opera, just so whenever he takes his mask off, he's more shocking. That's I question that. And so whenever I come to this film, I feel like it's doing the same thing, but with rape imagery. It's using it because it's shocking, but let's just apply this to this alien. And so let's make our monster really scary by using something that people rightly should be scared of.
Right. Well, and going back to like the war, and the Walking Wounded, those men had experienced a trauma and they experienced a loss that they then had to live with. Whereas the characters in Alien, this rape imagery that's happening to them, they all die. It's an attack in meant to kill, which does happen with rape, that people do die because of it. But a lot of times the victims of which have to linger on. They have to move on. They have experienced that loss and that trauma, and they have to deal with that, for the rest of their lives. And so using those aspects in just monster killings is I could see that could be just a flippant use.
Yeah, and for me, there's actually an idea that C.S. Lewis introduces in his space trilogy. So he wrote 3 books set in space. They're kind of space fantasies. But his second book, Paralandra, his main character, Ransom, comes in contact with a being that basically is the devil. And in that, he makes this really interesting observation. So this character is feeling all of this hatred because he's just come in contact with a being that represents decay and breakdown. And so he says in this, joy came from finding at last what hatred was made for. As a boy with an axe rejoices in finding a tree, or a boy with a box of colored chalks rejoices in finding a pile of perfectly white paper, so he rejoiced in the perfect congruity between his emotion and its object. And to me, the uncomfortable feeling that I get with Alien is, I think it's misplacing the object of the horror. I think we should rightly be horrified by, you shared with me a statistic, or how many women are...
Currently, the statistic is that 1 in 3 women, I believe before reaching adulthood, have experienced some sort of sexual assault or trauma.
Yeah.
Which is, it's not a small, that is a huge number. And so when you think of, that is a part of our culture, and that is affecting a large portion of people, and most likely it's been that way or worse for a long time, and just not really talked about and seen. And it's interesting too, because this did take place in the late 70s when this came out, and that people back then were not as comfortable talking about these kind of issues, and it being a part of social discussion like it is today with victims, with people who are dealing with those traumas.
For me, 1 in 3, we should rightly be horrified and shocked. And, the feelings that we get from Alien, from the monster that's doing this, we should realize that kind of trauma is happening to real people.
Yeah.
And I don't get the sense that this film really transfers that. I don't walk away from it. I did have a friend who said, he feels like in some ways with Ripley, and this maybe is part of the reason that she has become the icon she has, is that you have a character who overcomes her rapist, that she is ultimately able to win. And you could maybe take that away, but I still feel like for the most part this film is exploiting the feelings that we, again, if we have the right object, that we should be feeling, fear about and even anger towards.
Right. I actually want to read you, because what you said coordinates to a quote I found, because I was looking specifically at feminist film critic perspectives on this, because I wanted to see what is their thinking, because she is like Ripley's an iconic feminine character, and these other aspects of it are celebrated. I wanted to look at some critiques of it as well. And I found this woman, Marianne Johansson. She is a feminist film critic. And here's a quote for her that I found very interesting. "Do men really require a science fiction scenario to understand how horrific or unwanted violation of the body is? Maybe if our culture treated male-on-male rape like this, like the horror it is, men wouldn't need to turn to science fiction movies to understand the problem. Even if some men require such a prompt for their empathy, the Alien franchise still isn't the one that offers much in the way of true access to women's relationship with rape." And then you made me think of the same thing that you were saying is it necessary to, push all of this on a beast that you can hate, rather than talking about the issue as it is, and using that imagery and those plot devices in order to draw your horror on this fictional thing, when this is a real, this already is a real horror. And so I can see, with like what you were saying earlier, that can be seen as very exploitive and manipulative of using that imagery.
Yeah, I guess, and in walking away from this, I'm glad that we have taken a little bit of time to look at it for real. Because for me, like, I have known a few people who have, suffered from sexual assault, and a lot of times we don't think about males being victims, and I think partly that maybe because a lot of times that's when they're younger. Right now, some of the sex abuse scandals and things that have happened to boys, and so to me it does wake me up a little bit. Like, thinking about it outside of the movie does wake me up a little bit to, I've got a little boy. We have a second one on the way, and while still trusting people and not completely withdrawing, there is a certain amount of like vigilance, and even for those people who I know who have suffered, like I do need to continue to show compassion for the trauma that they've had. I think sometimes it's easy to get to a point where well, that was way back in the past, you need to move on, but it's a serious trauma.
Yeah, I agree. When you know people, when people have shared their experiences with you, and specifically now in our culture right now this is a big topic.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
That has been discussed and argued and complained about right now, but there's a lot of people sharing their perspectives and stories on it. One thing I found particularly interesting and problematic with Alien specifically is the alien itself, because it is a simple monster. It's a simple rapist monster. If you're going to use rape imagery, that's not fair, and it doesn't translate, because predators aren't the predators that we find, the real ones in real life, aren't usually strangers in a mask. Like, it's statistically been, said that a lot of times these people who perform the assaults are usually people people who are family members or friends, somebody who you would never assume that they would do something like that. They're not this crazy outside force that it jumps onto your ship and you're now dealing with. A lot of times that's not true. And then there's the idea that and so those are people whose faces you trust, and those are people who are people. And so there's also the idea of it's not people are humans and they do evil things. They're not just embodiments of evil, but it's all about which do you choose, which beast do you choose to feed? And so that to me, again, is where using this kind of imagery and then applying it to just a standard beast, again, can get where it's tricky. And I can see where people don't believe that that's a right way to go about it. I've one last quote that I wanted to hit here before we wrap it up, but this is from another film critic, and she says, "To describe the Alien franchise as a metaphor for male rape is to forget that the women in the Alien franchise are treated equally as invasively, and yet this sci-fi impregnation doesn't compare to the violent brutality frequently dished out on female characters as par, of course, across the breadth of cinema. It's no bad thing to encourage men to rethink the way in which women are treated on screen, but whether they recognize or appreciate this subtext, let's wait and see." And that's from Nikki Brogan, I believe, and she's a film critic with Screen International Sight and Sound. And I like where she ends is, whether they recognize or appreciate this subtext, let's wait and see. Because with any piece of artwork, any film, it permeates the culture, and this one has been around for a long time, and so it has influenced a lot of other art, a lot of other sci-fi. It is beloved by the sci-fi community and the film community. I mean, it is a classic. Alien it's one of those that's like, me myself, I've never seen it. It's like, how have you never seen this movie? And so,
well, I mean, it launched a lot of the careers of people who were involved in it.
True. So. Weaver had never been in a film before this. She was on stage, I believe, and then became huge right off the back of it. And so has this film had that positive cultural impact? That's
artistically, and we opened the show whenever we first started discussing this. The artistic merits of this film absolutely stand the test of time. It does not, to me, make a clear case for anything. It is using imagery to evoke a visceral reaction because they wanted to scare people.
Yeah, and
so for me, I mean, could you say, okay, Alien comes out in 79, and now however many years later we are we at 50 years later? No, 40 years, something like that.
Getting close, yeah. In next year.
Yeah. So, nearly half a century later, now we have the Me Too movement, and there are these still, social changes that are happening. I don't know that you can trace any of that to Alien. I do not feel comfortable giving this film any credit for that.
Right. The Year of the Woman does not hold its origins in Alien.
Yeah. Well, and there was the original Year of the Woman, in the late 80s, early 90s, when a lot of women
were elected to Congress as well.
Yeah. I don't think Alien had anything to do with any of those things.
Yeah, there's definitely some empowering parts to it, and I hope people who are listening to this who are like, I love Alien movie, I hope they don't feel like we just crapped on it the whole time, because it's like as a horror flick, it's horrifying. It does its job, and so if you're looking for a sci-fi horror mashup to scare you,
and honestly, it would have been easy for us just to talk about that. Like on this show, it would have been very easy just to discuss.
Right, because there's a lot of horror tropes and things that they play on. There's the jump scares with they're looking for the cat, and that there's not just a cat about that's going to eat you, but then it is the cat that jumps out, and they're all freaked out, and you're freaked out. There's easy. You could talk about the horror aspect of it in just those type elements a lot, but because that there's this deeper stuff that was intentionally put there, I feel like it can't be ignored. And once again, I come back to I don't believe that purpose and meaning was intentionally there in order to create empathy in men.
No.
I don't believe that was the intention that was there. And so again, I come back to, well, what was the intended message of the film? Because that's, with any piece of art, that really is why does this exist? And yes, there's plenty of films that because it's a visual medium like this one, that it's iconic because of its visuals and how it changed cinema and pushed these ideas into further projects, and we've seen that. And so that's a positive in and of itself. But going back again to what is the core message of this, and that's always what I'm most interested in looking at a piece of work. And here I feel again that I sit back and I'm a little perplexed.
Yeah. Well, I think largely the purpose of Alien is to give you a couple of hours where you're really scared of an alien on a ship. I think.
And it does its job.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I think that was the aim. That I don't know that there was any deeper message intended in the work.
Yeah. Well, before we get going here, we're going to be talking a little bit about what's going to be coming up on the Dead Padawan Society. This is a new year, and so we're going to be throwing some new things at you pretty soon. Brett, what do you got?
Yeah. Well, of course, the next episode, we're going to be doing our Star Trek Fantasy Draft. So I hope you've been studying up and getting yourself ready to recruit all of the members of the cast of Deep Space Nine, because they're the best.
I still have not watched a single episode of that.
You might want to, between now and the next episode, you may want to watch an episode or two. Maybe pick like a couple of the best of each series.
I'll probably get on YouTube and be like, what is Deep Space Nine?
So I'm excited about that, but I'm also excited. So far we've largely looked at films, and I think that's where both of us have learned most of what we know about sci-fi. That's where we've been exposed to it. That's how we love it and relate to it. But sci-fi has branched out into other media as well. And so I'm actually really looking forward to, we've talked about, books in the coming year. We've also, one that I'm really excited about is sci-fi songs. We're going to do an episode where
about the music.
So I'm looking forward to just trying some new things and looking at sci-fi in different media in the coming year.
Not just on the big screen or the small screen with television, but getting into books and other media. So specifically, it is a new year, and so we have challenged each other we are doing a little bit of a book swap here of sometime this year. I want you to read a book that I have for you.
Yep, and I've picked one out for you.
Okay, so what book have you chosen for me for this year?
All right, I have chosen, this is one that as a late teen or early 20-something I discovered and absolutely loved, and you're going to be familiar with the franchise, and this book is going to be completely different than anything you anticipate being familiar with the franchise. Sometime in 2019, Nick, you need to read Pierre Boulle's Planet of the Apes.
Oh, I didn't even realize that was a book.
Yep, it was a book before. This is before the film, so you'll discover that there are ideas that they're drawing from for the original Charlton Heston film, but it is its own beast, and it's very interesting.
So compared to the original Heston movie, it's very different.
There are some points where it significantly distinguishes itself from the other. So
okay. Awesome.
Yeah. All right. So what am I going to be reading in 2019?
So I have, and don't laugh at this. So recently,
did Dr. Seuss write a sci-fi book?
No. This is a bit of, I wouldn't call it a guilty pleasure, but it's not. I wouldn't say it's hard sci-fi, but I love The Galaxy Far, Far Away. And so I have a Star Wars book for you.
I need to read some Star Wars novelization. So,
well, they did away with all the old canon, and then they've been pumping out all this new canon in the Disney era.
You're not going to make me read about Sheev Palpatine, are you?
No. But that's actually the Tarkin. Yeah, that's not in the Tarkin book. That is in the. There is a Palpatine book. It's the Darth Sidious one, and it's actually in the old canon, I believe. But it was incredible with talking about Palpatine in his young years as he was an apprentice to
Darth Plagueis.
Darth Plagueis. Sorry, did I say Sidious?
Yeah.
I think, yeah. No, the book is Darth Plagueis, and it's really good, but it's no longer canon. I have a new canon book for you.
Oh, so you're actually going to see, because I would love to read some of the Legends books. Okay, so what?
There's good stuff in there, but there's also some wacky stuff in there. But yeah, within this new canon, I brought you a book. It's called Lost Stars.
Lost Stars?
Yes, and so it would be classified as a young adult novel, to which I was like, I want nothing to do with that. When it was announced, I was like, I don't want that in my Star Wars. Get that out of here. But it is by far one of the best things that they've put out since the new canon has started. And the reason why it's good, it's by Claudia Gray, and it's really cool because the book takes place during the three original films of 4, 5, and 6, and it spans those events, and it follows two characters who have grown up together, a guy and a girl, and on the same planet, and then they both join the Empire, and then they move up in the ranks, and they are actually on the first Death Star. They're on the first Death Star. So
were they on vacation when?
No, they were they are Empire employees, and so what's really
but I mean, like, how'd they avoid the I guess spoilers?
I won't get into that. But what's
first Death Star exploded, Nick?
It did. Oh wait, no! I'm remembering that wrong. They had friends that were on there. Anyway,
I was about to say,
I'm sorry, I'm remembering this wrong. But
we were visiting family on Bespin.
Yeah. But the thing I really like about this book is that it shows the perspective of normies in Star Wars.
Cool.
And specifically of how can an empire be built on. This type of empire be built on normal people, and it really dives deep into the ideas that are put forward and how did the empire get so many people to go along with what it was doing. But at one point, one of the two characters defects to the rebels, but the other stays with the empire. And so then the rest of the events of the original trilogy play out with them on opposing
that's cool
sides. And so it is very well done, and it's really it's fun because you get tastes of, because you know the story, you're like, oh, that's what they're talking about, and this is about to happen, or this has just happened. And it's really well done, like weaving like new canon into what has already existed, but it's not messing with any of the story. It's a side story within that, but it fleshes out the Star Wars universe in a really fun way.
Yeah. We also want to issue a challenge to our listeners in the coming weeks. If you want to be prepped for an episode that we're going to do, you should check out Isaac Asimov's I, Robot.
Yeah, we're going to be reading that one together.
So, and I'm looking forward to that. I've read it before. Have you?
No, I still haven't, so I've got 2 on my list now. One, I, Robot will need to come first, but I will get to Planet of the Apes too. That, I seriously didn't realize that was a book.
Yep. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to seeing what you think as you read it.
Yeah, so at home, if you guys want to read along with us, pick up a...
Have we just started a book club?
There you go,
the Dead Padawans Society book club.
Pick up iRobot, or if you can tell us what Alien is about, please.
Yeah, if you know the theme of Alien, please contact us at deadpadawanssociety@gmail.com or comment on our Facebook page or Instagram or Twitter,
Yeah.
or MySpace.
I have a feeling that we may get people yelling at us on this episode, so we may get a lot of answers on what this film's intention and meaning is.
So you think our 4 audience members are
gonna feel passionate?
Feel passionate about it? Okay.
Yeah. Or you're gonna get the random person whose search engine has brought them here and hates everything we have to say, which is the internet.
That sounds exactly like the internet I know.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, guys, thank you as always for joining us on the Dead Padawan Society. We appreciate your support, your feedback. Please leave a comment, share us on social media. We're on all the platforms, so connect with us there, and we'd love to have you back for another episode. All right, Brett, may the force be with you.
And live long and prosper.